What's up guys, Miggy the Tech Guy here, and today we're going to talk about the OnePlus AT stock camera app versus the GCam port. There are some pretty interesting things about each of these cameras and why you would want to use them in specific use cases. I'm about to talk about them here today. Let's get into it. Okay, to start it off here, we have a picture of a dead willow tree that's in my backyard, and I'm going to have the stock camera app on the left as well as the GCam port on the right, so there's no confusion. I'll make sure I mark them, but you can definitely see here that the stock here actually made it a lot darker in my opinion. It didn't really bring out any of the detail of the tree as much. It's really dark as far as the trees go. You can't see as much in the shadows versus the highlights. It's kind of, I don't know, I actually prefer the GCam port in this scenario because you can see a lot more of the tree and the bark and everything right there. I think it's important to note that they both handled the sky about the same. There is a little bit more color in the sky in the stock camera app, so whatever processing they are using in the OnePlus camera app is a little bit more vibrant with the blues, it seems, here in this photo versus the GCam port. Okay, the next photo I'm going to show you is actually from the wide angle lens, and it's, again, left is stock and the right is GCam. So you can see it did the same exact thing as in the regular main camera, where it made it a lot darker, so you can't really see the bark on this tree versus seeing the bark on the tree in the GCam port. There seems to be a little bit more sharpness in the GCam port as well. It's way more soft with the processing from the OnePlus camera stock app. So that is something interesting to note from the wide angle lenses, and it's clearly not as good as the main camera, but I think the GCam shines really well with the ultra wide camera here in this scenario. I will note that the sun looks a little less blown out in the stock camera app this time around. So you can see that there's a little bit of gradient into the clouds. So you can kind of tell that the sun was shining a little bit better there versus it washed out on the GCam port. So that's an interesting thing to note. You're kind of getting in the ultra wide camera that there's a little bit more depth in that sun from the stock app versus the GCam port, which is very interesting to me. The next one we have is a stick. I thought they handled it very similarly in terms of depth of field with the background blur here. There's no portrait mode. This is just me taking the photo, and it's from the same angle, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of a trend here that they're at different, it feels like a little bit of different focal lengths, comparatively speaking, from the stock camera app compared to the GCam port. But you're seeing here, it's kind of switched around. In some of these up close shots, you actually get more dark contrasty looks from the GCam port versus the stock, where it feels a little bit more blown out in the highlights. So it's a little stark contrast from when we shot the wider scene with the willow tree. This is more up close, and you're seeing a lot more blown, like the highlights aren't completely blown out in the stock. The stock is still handling its own, but you're seeing a lot more depth in the GCam port in the shadows and just the contrast of the photo, which I personally like a little bit more. So in this scenario, I would definitely choose the GCam port versus the stock camera app. In the previous one, I would have definitely chose the GCam port versus the stock app. So it's really just kind of starting to show a trend here that the GCam port is a lot better than the stock processing on the OnePlus camera. So that's very interesting to me. So I'm going to go ahead and say that the Pixel wins in this scenario. These next two photos are actually very interesting to me. So here you see that the shadows of the trees that were behind me when I was taking this photo, these photos were taken seconds apart from each other. The shadows are almost non-existent in the stock camera app, but for some reason they're contrasted a lot more heavy in the Google Pixel camera app. And that's just kind of like a trend here with this Pixel app, is it does give you more contrast and more dynamic range as far as shadows to highlights goes, and it doesn't blow out the highlights too much in any of the photos that you're taking, versus the stock camera app definitely brings up the highlights a lot more. It didn't even show the shadows pretty much. You barely can see that there were trees behind me in that one, and I'm a little confused as to why it did this. I'm not 100% sure as to why they it didn't show the shadows as much as the GCam did, but I guess it just depends on your preference here of what you prefer. But I'm gonna go ahead and say the GCam wins this one as well. So in this next photo comparison, we're going to be showing you some stones I think this is a very interesting showcase of the different focal lengths that this camera really does provide, depending on which one you're going for. If you're going for the stock camera or if you're going for the Gcam port, this is an interesting trade-off because it feels like they're kind of trading blows with saturation to me and vibrance. So if you're looking at this one, again, the left side is going to be the stock camera app, but it gave you more vibrant colors this time around versus the duller colors in the Gcam port. And this one is more of a toss-up for me. I would honestly say and argue that I like both of these photos in different ways, and they both showcase that they're very capable. You could get away with posting either of these on social media and you probably wouldn't get much of a difference out of people. Obviously, I think people tend to steer more towards the saturation and vibrance. So the stock camera app probably edges it out a little bit in this scenario for me. In terms of what I would post on the internet, I prefer the stock camera app this time around versus the Gcam in this scenario. So for these two photos, I thought this was an interesting comparison for sure because of the reds, and I know how difficult it is for most camera apps to display reds and how different it really can be just depending on the processing of what the camera's doing in the background. And for me, this time around, I prefer the stock camera app over the Gcam in this sense. I guess it depends on what people really want in a photo. If you want more true to life, the Gcam is definitely giving you that here. And then the stock camera app is processing more, which is very interesting to me. So if you're not going to be editing your photos and messing around with them at all or tweaking them, the stock camera app is probably what I would choose, just because I like the more vibrant red versus the dull red. And I like how they handled the black of the bird feeder here versus the dullness in the black of the bird feeder. On the Gcam port, I much prefer the sharpness that is coming from. I know it's a little over sharpened. Maybe people don't like that, don't have a preference toward that. But when you're posting this on social media, this is going to be something that quality is going to be lost anyway. So you're going to look at something that's a lot more dull when you post it on the internet versus just looking at it on your computer. So I would actually go with the stock camera app on this comparison because its reds are more vibrant. The overall photo is more vibrant in general versus the greens and all the other tones. You're looking at a better photo overall to me with the stock AT camera app versus the Gcam port in this scenario. Here's another fun comparison that on the phone actually looked a little bit different versus me looking here on the computer trying to, get the details and really see the differences between these photos. The highlights again are a little bit brighter on the stock camera app versus the Gcam. In my opinion, the Gcam won this one again as well. I just prefer how it reproduced the colors and how it looks contrasty, which is for social media purposes or posting in general, I would rather post the Gcam port in this scenario versus the stock camera app. But I think the stock camera app held its own in this one, where the highlights don't look too overblown or too high, in my opinion. So, as comparatively speaking, I would definitely choose the Gcam port, but these ones were a lot more close versus the other ones that we've currently looked at, just because it's handling greens and blues pretty well in either camera app. And I think you'd be happy with either or photo when you're posting it onto social media. In this scenario, I thought this was really interesting to me. I was actually able to get closer with the regular main lens on the device using the Gcam port than I was using the stock OnePlus camera app. So that was an interesting thing to me because, again, the stock camera app comes with a macro mode. So it uses the ultra wide lens that can get closer. But through the main lens, you're actually getting a better, closer photo using Gcam versus using the stock one. And I actually prefer the Gcam port in this one too, just because it feels like it gives you a little bit more in your face sharpening. It's not as dull. It's just a nicer photo, even though we are getting a lot of fringing in the depth of field in this photo. It seems a little bit more of the highlights are a little bit more blown out on the stock app, and there's not enough contrast between the shadows and the highlights, as is a trend in the stock app most of the time. So in this scenario, I would definitely choose the Gcam, but I do still want to note the stock app can get closer with its macro. So I'll show you that here in comparison to the Gcam and how close it can get. You can get really close up with the macro shots using the macro mode on the stock app versus just getting close with the Gcam port. The Gcam port still gets respectively close. I should say that it, as far as the main lens goes, it goes really close. So that's impressive to me. But once you put on macro mode, obviously it can get quite a bit closer. And for that, I'm going to say that I'm going to choose the Gcam still, even though if you want, a little bit more flexibility as far as camera goes, the stock camera app is the only one that's going to give you macro mode. So that is something that you should definitely consider if you're looking to take really up close photos, because I think it does a really good job at that as well. So regular main camera, definitely choosing Gcam. But if you wanted to have a little bit more flexibility, you would go with the super macro mode on the stock AT camera app. This one that I'm about to show you actually is a lot closer when you're looking on the phone. And the differences, once you blow them up on your computer, then you can actually see the differences and which one is actually processing this much better. And this time around, I am 100% going for the processing on the stock camera app. It just processed the blacks a lot better. It gave you a lot better bark and contrast in the tree. It feels way more grainy and overprocessed on the Gcam port in this scenario. I'm not sure why it did that, but I much prefer the processing of the stock camera app this go around. And that's where we're seeing a little bit of blows traded. OnePlus has definitely stepped up their processing game once you take photos of certain things. And it did a very fantastic job of showcasing how it could just be your main camera to use most of the time. The processing has gotten a lot better than when they first started on the OnePlus 7 Pro. They used to not be really great with their cameras on their phones, and that's usually where it was lacking to stop it from being a flagship. But over the years, they've definitely honed in their software, and I think they're doing a really great job of showcasing why I would use it in this scenario and a lot of the scenarios when you're outside in really good lighting. So this is one of those times where I'm 100% going with the stock AT camera app. And then immediately after that photo, I switched it over to some up close of these flowers. And again, I told you can get a bit closer with the Gcam, but not only did it get closer this time around, I much prefer the processing and the golden hue that you're getting from the Gcam port. It just did a way better job with these flowers. I would much rather post the Pixel Gcam port than I would the stock in this scenario, 1,000,000%. It just looks way better. And maybe it's your opinion, you like the more dull colors, but in my opinion, I'm 1,000,000% going for the Pixel Gcam port in this scenario. And then here's two photos of a light right by the front door of my house, where it's a little bit harder to choose a photo here because I think there's a lot going on in terms of processing from both camera apps. And this is really up to preference for people because I think they were very close in nature of what they were trying to reproduce. There is a little bit more depth to me in the stock camera app this time around. So that's something to take note of, is I actually prefer how the black towards the bottom of that light looks versus the Gcam port. So just because of how it kind of handles the shadows on the stock one, I'm actually going with a stock in this one by a narrow margin because the Gcam port did a respectable job in reproducing everything in this picture. So I'm going with stock on this one, just slightly. And I decided to take a photo here of the trees. They're pretty large trees and they take up a lot of space. They're pine trees, they're dropping lots of pine cones, but these photos are very similar in how they were processed. And I think that's very interesting. If you can see, there's a little bit more green in the Gcam port, and that's probably where I would probably choose the Gcam, is that I prefer how it handled shadows. I prefer how it handled the colors, and the bark of the tree, if you notice, is a little darker on the stock camera app, and I actually prefer that on the tree. And this, like just the tree itself, but the actual green in the photo is duller in the stock camera app, which actually makes me and pushes me more towards the Gcam port in this photo comparison. Comparatively speaking, I actually prefer Gcam just a little bit more because those greens are a little bit more poppin', and that's something, especially when you're posting it on social media, that's probably gonna, lose color a little bit because of the processing there on Facebook or Instagram or wherever you're gonna happen to post this. So just by a small margin, I'm going with the Gcam on these photos. And here we go again. This one's kind of interesting. On the phone, there is a much starker contrast compared from the stock camera app to the Gcam port. I much prefer how the lines on that turtle right there are more defined on the Gcam port, and so are the wood creases, and everything is just a little bit more defined via the Gcam port than it is the stock app, and the stock app is a little bit more high up on the highlights compared to the Gcam port, and that's why the Gcam in this scenario is going to edge out. It just looks a little bit more contrasty, and I like contrasty photos. I think a lot of people tend to go towards the contrasty look. So in this scenario, I'm going with Gcam versus the stock camera app. In this photo, it's a little bit harder for me to choose. I did want to get a more up close photo again because I like how close you can get. And in this round of things, I was actually able to get about the same exact distance just to show you guys that for some odd reason, the Gcam in this scenario actually dulled out the sun. The sun was actually shining pretty good, and you can kind of see that in the stock camera app. It was a little bit more shiny versus more dull and gloomy on the Gcam port. And for that reason, I think I'm actually going to choose the stock camera app. It's not crazy different, and I think if you posted these, you know, people are obviously going to see that that one looks a little bit more sunny, and that might be the reason why somebody would choose it versus a dark and more bleak photo from the Gcam, even though the contrast is better. And I like that. I love the contrast of the Gcam, and the Gcam did its own thing here, and it looks cool, but I prefer it looking a little bit more sunny and uplifting in the stock app, and that's where I'm going with that one. And here we go with a little bit more close up again. I actually was able to get a little bit closer with the stock app in this one versus the Gcam port, which I thought was interesting. And it's producing yellow about the same. As you can see here, it looks very, very, very similar in regards to how it produces the yellows and how it fringes with the bokeh in the background. And the sharpness of the leaf is actually where things actually look a little bit more sharp on the stock app. I think it handled this up close shot a little bit better on the stock app versus the Gcam port, which was very interesting for me because when I was ready to take this photo, I thought for sure I'd prefer the Gcam port, but I actually prefer how the stock handled color reproduction, how it handled sharpness, and how it got a little bit closer. I think that's really interesting. Looks really, really nice, and I'm gonna go with the stock camera app on this one. It should also be noted that I can actually do the super macro again in this scenario and show you how close I'm able to get to that golf ball. It does produce the yellow slightly differently than it did when you're, because it's using the ultra wide lens, so it's not as sharp, tack sharp, but it is still pretty sharp, and you're getting really close to things, comparatively speaking, to the Gcam port because you can't do super macro. So I am going to give a little bit of an edge up for the flexibility as well, not only just picking the stock app, but you can go even closer if you wanted to post a really cool super macro shot of the golf ball. And here we have the last outside shot that I'm actually going to show you guys. I know this is a little extensive for outside, but I just wanted to get all different scenarios to show you guys and showcase and really get a feel of how and when you're going to want to use the stock app versus the Gcam. And here we have a scenario where I actually like the stock a little bit more again. I think it processed it really well in this scenario. I don't know why it didn't. It processed the colors, it's more dynamic, it feels a little bit more contrasty versus the dullness of the Gcam port. You would think if I didn't show you any labels for this, I feel like you would think the Gcam port was actually the stock one. And so it really handled its own here, and OnePlus really shined through on their processing when it gets to these certain scenarios where the light is hitting it. And I think it really looks great. I think there was a, I'm gonna pick the stock camera app in this scenario. For sure, I'm picking the stock. There's a lot less, it just feels more dull on the Gcam this time around and less sharp. So I want the more sharp photo because that processing, when you put it on social media again, is going to be dulling it down anyway. So if there's something that you want to post on the internet, I'm 100% going with the stock AT camera app. All right, so I actually want to move inside with the next photos, but I wanted to switch it up and showcase portrait mode on both camera apps. And I'm going to tell you right now, hands down, I would always pick the Google Gcam port versus the stock camera app for portrait mode. Look at how much different it showcases the blur. I will say it cuts it out a little bit better on the stock, but if I guarantee if we would have taken a couple more shots, I would have been able to get my ear not so blurred out in this picture on the Gcam side of things, but it just is so much sharper in the image versus the out of focus look that I was given via the stock app. That was very interesting to me. And something really interesting to note, like Google just handles the portrait mode so much better than the stock camera app does. I didn't think it was going to be this much of a difference, but you can even tell in the fabric of my sweater, like it doesn't even look the same. It looks like one's an oil painting and the other one is a real photo. You know, it looks like a real nice portrait. And if I were to edit it, I could probably get, you know, this is a much better photo to post on the internet for sure. I would 1,000,000% go with the portrait mode on the GCam port versus the stock every time. There's never been a scenario where I would go with the portrait mode on the stock camera app in this scenario. Here we have another photo of my dog, one of my dogs. His name is Polar Bear, so shout out Polar Bear. He has 2 different colored eyes and he's a really cool dog. So here we are. This one is interesting to me for 2 reasons. Look at the difference between these 2 photos. I thought when I was looking at them on my phone that the first one, it would have been the GCam port, and the second one would have been from the stock, but it isn't. The processing on the stock one looks more vibrant in color, but it lacks in sharpness versus the more true to color, less vibrant pixel app. And in this scenario, I want the sharpness, especially when you're up close on the dog. It just looks, again, like an oil painting versus something it looks way better. It just looks super sharp. And so you can see the hairs on his nose. That's the biggest thing I'm going to show you. It looks really blurry on the stock app versus really sharp on the Pixel camera app. So the GCam port wins in this scenario for me 100%. I could tweak the saturation to even match the one that's processing in this, or from the stock app. I would much rather choose the GCam port for this picture. And I also want to note, this one was with less light. So they both handle light pretty well. You know, they're able to bring up the light in the room versus what it really was when you're looking at it through your own eyes. But the GCam just gives you way more sharpness. It gives you, it enhances the sharpness here. When the other one looks a little bit more washed out, comparatively speaking, I would definitely go with the GCam in this scenario just because processing just got handled a lot better. Again, it looks more like a painting when you're going for the stock app versus GCam gives you a more real photo. You can even see that in the wall. You can see that in the bowl with the flowers in it. You can see that in the purple flowers themselves. Everything kind of melts together using the stock app versus there's a more contrast between the petals of the purple flowers on the GCam port. In this scenario, I'm going with the GCam port 100%. So pulling these 2 photos up on a computer really changes my mind and how I felt about this photo. When I was looking at this processing on my phone versus looking at it on a computer, I actually preferred how the Pixel handled this picture. But now blowing it up on a computer and actually seeing the difference, there's way more noise in the GCam port versus the stock app. I think the stock app just handled everything a lot better in this one. So I'm gonna go with the stock camera app versus the Pixel on this photo, just because of how it handled the shadows and the contrast and giving you way less noise in the dark parts versus super enhancing it via the GCam port. So in this one, I'm going with the stock app. Handled how the lighting was. It shows you a little bit more contrast. There's a little bit slight more vibrance. I think they're very similar on vibrance, but the noise just really gets canceled out on the GCam. So I am going to pick the stock app in this one. And we have a photo that I switched over to here, and it's flopped for me now. Compared to the last photo we just saw, this photo is going to be the GCam because it gave me more vibrance, it gave me less noise. So they kind of trade blow for blow in so many different scenarios. So it's like, I feel like a lot of the times you're going to want to use both camera apps just when you're taking photos of anything, because look at this scenario. The previous one, I prefer the stock one, but now I'm preferring the GCam and how I process this photo. It gave me way more vibrant colors, way less dull and way less noise. GCam handled this one perfectly, in my opinion, especially with the low light that was in this room. It was just getting light from the windows, and it just handled it way better on the GCam. Gave me more detail, more vibrance, less noise. This was a good process for the GCam port in this one. And then here's another photo that I'm going to choose the stock one just because it gave me more vibrance and less dull photo and gave me less noise again. So this is the lighting is coming from the left-hand side. It's really kind of hard because I feel like the GCam one is sharper. Maybe you could enhance the color of the GCam just to match the left one. So maybe as I'm looking at these two, I'm gonna probably choose the Gcam, and then I'll just edit it to be a little bit more saturation in it, in my opinion. This is kind of a toss-up for me, for you guys. So if you guys look at these ones, let me know what you think in this scenario. I'm actually intrigued to see what most people think of any of these photos, but these ones were very interesting to me because you get a little bit more sharpness out of the Gcam and a little bit more vibrance out of the stock camera app in this one. So in my opinion, I think I'm going with Gcam on this one, just so and then I would enhance the colors if I really wanted to. I'm going Gcam in this one just by a tiny hair margin versus the stock app in this one, just because of the sharpness of the Gcam port. And here's another scenario where I'm definitely picking the Gcam port. It just did a way better job of this photo. It gave me more light, it gave me more sharpness, it gave me more vibrance. Stock camera app didn't even win in this one at all. There's nothing that I would say that I prefer out of this comparison here via the stock camera app. The stock camera app really just kind of did a poor job of reproducing colors, reproducing light, and everything. So I'm 100% picking Gcam on this picture versus the stock one. Now in this photo, I want to show you guys, it's very interesting to me. So I'm going to start off with the left one is from the stock camera app, and it is how the room actually looked. So if you're looking at it, I mean, the stock camera app handled it really well, even without putting on nightscape. This is an interesting thing to me. It was really dark in that room. And when we look at the side here, the pixel, the Gcam port actually brought up the light with the exception of noise. So there is a bit of noise, but their night sight handled this very well, in my opinion. And it gave you a lot of detail in terms of what was actually in the room versus the darkness of the stock camera. And then I'm going to show you guys here. I'll switch out the dark one for the nightscape from the stock camera app, and it gave you less detail in the stock one, so it didn't sharpen it as much. But I think it was doing that on purpose because it didn't want to give you too much noise in the shadows, so it just gave you a more evened out photo. And in this one, this is, I think, purely up to preference, especially when you're using night modes on either camera app. I prefer the one from the Gcam port versus the stock one, but I don't think you could go wrong with either of these ones. It's a purely preference, in my opinion, when it comes to these night modes. But I would probably just, by a narrow margin, pick the Gcam port in this scenario. I'm interested to see what you guys would pick, and if you're more interested in having a good amount of detail with a little less over sharpening via the stock one, or maybe you want it to just really bring up the shadows and show you everything that's in the photo, whatever you're taking of. So in this scenario, I'm going to choose Gcam, but I'm interested to see what you guys would choose. Here we have the last photo that I'm going to show you guys. It's gonna be the Gcam immediately, just to say off the bat. I prefer the Gcam in this photo. It was in the dark, and I think the Gcam just gave you a bit more detail in my dog's fur, and you can see there, I'll zoom in, so you can just see that it's a way more oil painty. In the stock camera app, as it seems when there's less light, it overexposes the highlights and washes it out way more. This looks more like a painting. This looks more like a real photo on the Gcam port. So in my opinion, I'm definitely going with the Gcam in the lower lighting scenarios. Most of the time, I'm probably going to pull out the Gcam port just because it produces a way better photo and doesn't overexpose the highlights as much. And that's really nice, especially when you have a really sharp light coming from one room and being in the dark part of a room and taking a photo of something. This is just really abundantly clear that Google's sharpening and post-processing is just a lot better via this Gcam port than it is the stock camera app. So I'm going Gcam all day. I'm interested to see what you guys think. Let me know. So the last thing I'm going to show you guys, not out of photos, this is between two videos. So you wouldn't want to use the Gcam port for video. It just doesn't have the stabilization in it, and that's all right. I don't think everybody's going to use the Gcam port for the video anyway. In these scenarios, it's really what you're trying to get Google's processing as far as pictures go. So it's no contest here. You're definitely using the stock app if you're going to do any video recording. It's just way more stable. It's going to be better in processing the video, and I think that OnePlus just does a better job of that. So in this scenario, 100% going with the stock camera app. If you're shooting video of any kind, just go through the stock app. That's just what I'm going to say. So in conclusion, the OnePlus AT stock camera app is definitely something that you would use in a lot of cases. They've come a long way in their processing, and I really believe that OnePlus did some real magic with their cameras as of late, and I'm impressed. I'm genuinely impressed by how their cameras work and how they were able to get so close to the GCam port as in the earlier years. In the earlier years, it was a complete stark contrast. You'd much rather use the GCam app, but there are some cases where I think it trades blows with the GCam port, even at its recommended settings. So that's pretty interesting to me. I'm interested in seeing what your guys' take is. So in the comments below, tell me what if you're using the stock app or if you're going to use the GCam port because you've seen some significant changes in its dynamic range and its contrast and all that stuff. I want to hear the discussion below. So let me know what you guys think. If you like the video, go ahead and like it. If you dislike it, dislike the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want more content from me. And as always, I'm Miggy the Tech Guy, and I'm out. Peace.